Hello, everyone. This is Olga Cardamon from Eagle Travel Tours to Russia. And before I get to the main point of today's video, I just really wanted to thank you all for all of the support that you have given us over the past couple weeks since we launched our YouTube channel. I really appreciated getting all of your comments, suggestions, and especially hearing about the topics of my videos for the future. And a lot of you have expressed your interest in learning more about the Romanovs, our royal family. And so I decided to create a series of videos on our remarkable royal family because, there's no way I can make one video about all of them. I mean, this family is so incredible. There are so many fascinating stories there that it would just be a shame to make one video. Or otherwise, it would have just been a really long one, and you'd probably get bored. I feel like I don't want to dump all of my Romanov information on you all at once. And so originally, I thought about creating a video about the 18th century of the Romanovs, so everyone who ruled during that century. And I started making notes, and I realized that I have so much to tell you about just one czar that I'm just going to devote this whole video to that one person and his fascinating life. So I'm starting my series about the videos on the Romanovs with one of my favorite Romanovs, whose name is Peter the Great. If you've heard anything about the Russian royal family, that is probably one of the few people that everyone knows about. So Peter the Great is a really significant figure in the Russian history. But the thing is, he was actually one of the three kids of his father, Tsar Alexei. And he was not meant to become the Tsar. So he was, first of all, the youngest. He had an older brother who was supposed to rule. But unfortunately, his older brother turned out to be sick. It was hard for him to rule. Then he also had a sister who was really wise and really smart. But that was the 17th century, late 17th century. She was a woman. There's no way she could have just ruled the country all by herself. So what ended up happening is the three of them were ruling together. That was quite a fascinating picture. But eventually, as they grew older, there was a struggle for power. At first, his brother was eliminated, and then it was just Peter and his sister. They both really wanted to rule, but Peter was the one who overpowered his sister Sophia, and she was confined in a monastery. This is how Peter the Great started his rule. The thing is, before all of this struggle happened, he was living with his mother, kind of like in a remote part of Moscow, because Peter's father, he had two wives, and he had children from two wives, and his mom was kind of less popular, so they lived a little bit further away from the Kremlin. But the place where they lived, it bordered with a German settlement, because that was also a time where a lot of international settlements started appearing in Moscow. And Peter the Great, as he was growing up, he spent a lot of time in the German settlement. And amazingly, that played a huge role in what Peter the Great became, what kind of a czar he became. Because, first of all, he realized that Russia was developing in a really limited way. There were other cultural ways out there, and that gave Peter an idea that he needed to educate his people. Secondly, life in the German settlement was just so much fun. There was so much beer, And there were so many beautiful women who were just much less shy than the traditional Russian women that Peter would be spending time with. And he started spending a lot of time with his German friends, and his mother got pretty worried about him, and she didn't want him to get in trouble. So really quickly, she decided to marry him, and he was forced to marry this woman who he didn't really love. She definitely wasn't as fun as some of the women in the German settlements, but that was it. So he was forced to get married. So there he was. He became the Russian Tsar. He was married. It was his time to rule after he overpowered his sister. And even there, he did something that no other Russian Tsars had done. Instead of going straight to the Kremlin and just giving away orders, he decided to go on a big Euro trip. Because he wanted to learn about life in other countries. He wanted to see how they were ruled. He wanted to see where science was, where engineering was. And so he went on a big trip. And the crazy thing is, he didn't even go as the Russian Tsar. So he went anonymously as a carpenter, a shipbuilder. So he stayed with just regular people, and during his Euro trip, of course, the rulers of other countries, they knew who that really was, and he was received at royal courts of other countries. But also, what he got to do is he got to actually learn all these different professions and crafts. So, for example, he would work as a shipbuilder, and he would learn shipbuilding. In St. Petersburg, there is actually a monument. You can see that it's called, we call it Tsar the Carpenter, but really what he's doing there, he's building a ship, which is pretty amazing. It's a great tribute to the kind of person that Peter the Great was. He learned a lot of other professions as well, including, weirdly, a dentist. So he knew how to pull teeth. And even later, when he came back to Russia, if any of the people in his court had trouble with their teeth, he'd be the one just pulling their teeth out. Another thing that came out of him learning about teeth is that he didn't really let his kids eat a lot of sweets. And later, his daughter, Tsarina Elizabeth, really complained about it. But I'll tell you about that in one of my next videos. Anyway, he learned all these different things in Europe. It also showed him that a person can have quite a modest life. And when he came back to Russia, he kept leading this really modest life. If you look at this picture, you can see the little house of Peter the Great. This house is still located in St. Petersburg. You can go and see it. And it's tiny. It just has a kitchen, a bedroom, a dining room, and it's teeny tiny. It serves its purpose, and that's it. Peter the Great did not like grand spaces. He wanted to just live in comfort. He wanted to live simply. Just to compare, check out the house of one of the heads of the Russian government back then, Prince Alexander Menshikov. His palace was so much bigger than Peter the Great's. Or check out this place. Maybe you've seen that before. That's the Winter Palace, also known as the Hermitage, that was built for his daughter. She was clearly deprived as a kid, and she really wanted to make up for it. So this is where she chose to live. Anyway, Peter the Great was quite a modest person. He did learn in Europe that Russia was destined to become a great country. The kind of country that has a big place in the world, that has a say in the world. And he realized that Russia would not become such a country without access to the sea. And so he found an area that would give him access to the Baltic Sea. The problem was that area belonged to Sweden. So what Peter the Great had to do, he had to start a war with Sweden, which he did. The war lasted for 20 years, as a result of which Russia gained access to the Baltic Sea, in my hometown, St. Petersburg was founded. The crazy thing is, so before that, the capital of Russia was Moscow. But what Peter decided to do is to move the capital to this new city, St. Petersburg. The reason he wanted to do that is that he wanted this new port city to develop quickly. And if he moved the capital there, that would mean that the court would move there and the economics in the area would grow really rapidly. And he wanted that. So he moved the capital to St. Petersburg. But the crazy thing is, he did that before the war with Sweden was over. So technically, for a couple years, the capital of Russia was located on Swedish territory. Yeah, this guy didn't want to wait until things were official, right? Anyway, he founded St. Petersburg. And after all of his military campaigns, after all of his European trips, he realized that the family life that he had was not just enough for him. The wife that he was forced to marry was not the kind of woman he wanted to be with. He needed to find someone new. And his guy, Prince Alexander Menshikov, who I mentioned already, found him just the right woman. He met her in Sweden. She was a laundress there. And originally, she was brought to him to become one of his mistresses, which in Russia we call favorites. Anyway, she was supposed to become one of his favorites, but he figured that Peter the Great would like her more and he would appreciate him introducing them. So he passed her along to Peter the Great, and Peter the Great fell in love with this woman, who became future Empress Catherine I. Not to be confused with Catherine the Great, which was Catherine II. More on that later. Anyway, Catherine I was not your typical Russian lady. She was a laundress, so she was not shy. She was willing to speak openly. She would accompany Peter the Great to the military campaigns. She would ride a horse. And something else that Peter would really appreciate, she actually could do stuff with her hands. Like she would darn his socks, for example. Or when Peter the Great would become especially stressed out, she would massage his shoulders or his head. She was just really good around the house and fun. So he wanted her to become his wife. He wanted her to become the next Russian empress. But as you can imagine, there were a couple problems with that. The first one, as you can imagine, I mentioned already, she was a laundress. She was not a noble lady. The publicity would not like that. Another thing, she was from Sweden, so she was a Catholic. And in Russia, we're Russian Orthodox. That's, another problem. And the elephant in the room, Peter the Great, he was already married. And in the 18th century, divorce was not really a thing. So he had to solve this somehow. And so his wife was forced to become a nun. So she was moved into a nunnery. And since she did, Peter the Great was now free to marry the second time. And so he married Catherine I. What a fascinating life story. People back then loved Catherine I and called her the Russian Cinderella because it truly is a real-life Cinderella story. Anyway, Peter the Great and his wife had quite a happy life. St. Petersburg was rapidly growing. The Russian territory was growing because he kept continuing military campaigns. He also really wanted to develop the inner life in his country. He wanted the culture to develop because he's seen all of that stuff in Europe. But Russians were not that educated, and most of the literature, architecture, music was all centered around the church and the church life. He wanted our culture to become more secular. So he started different changes in the royal court. He forced the nobility to go to different receptions, and they had to behave a certain way because he wanted them to have manners. So, for example, they were not allowed to swear. They were not allowed to eat with their hands. They now had to use a knife and fork. He was pretty good with punishing them for breaking the rules. For example, in this picture, you can see what is known as the Goblet of the Grand Eagle. It can be found in one of the suburban palaces called Peterhof. And people who broke the rules at Peter the Great's receptions were forced to drink this goblet of the Grand Eagle filled with vodka. As you can imagine, a lot of them passed out right away. Even though vodka was not the kind of vodka that we know now, it was much, it had much less alcohol in it. But still, imagine drinking that thing full of wine. Most people passed out anyway. Or another example. So, what about not nobility? What about simple people? Well, Peter the Great wanted to educate them as well, so he started the first museum that was located in St. Petersburg. It was called Kunstkamera, or the Chamber of Curiosities, where he displayed the collection of curiosities that he gathered during his travels. It had just things that were representative of different cultures, like he had some clothing and shoes from Holland and stuff like that. But he also had a medical collection of one of the Dutch doctors that basically had fetuses with different oddities that were just put in jars and formaldehyde. And he wanted people to go and look at that stuff because he wanted people to learn more. But people in the 18th century, they were scared of that stuff. They did not want to go to this museum. So there is a legend, I do not know how true that actually is, but it's a fascinating one, that he started this new rule for the people who would come to Kunstkamera. Man would be served a free shot of vodka, and women would be served a cup of coffee for free, as long as they look at the exhibits. So people were quite sly about it. So they would go into the museum, get their free shot, and run away. People were hard to educate back then. Moreover, several times people tried to burn Kunstkamera to the ground. So we only became cultured people much later, after the time of Peter the Great. Anyway, not only was he a visionary, he was also known as the hero czar, and he died a heroic death. One thing that you might have heard about St. Petersburg is that the river that the city is located on, called the Neva River, is prone to flooding. And from time to time, really big floods happen. And one of such floods happened in 1725. It was a bad one. It was in November, too, and it's really cold in Russia in November. So Peter the Great tried to save some people and pull them out of the water. And it was really cold, so he got pneumonia, and unfortunately he died of pneumonia. He died a heroic death. After his death, his wife, Catherine I, ruled for a whole other year after him, and then she died as well. What a fascinating story, right? And a long one. So I'm going to stop this today. I'm not going to tell you about more Romanovs, but I'm wondering, do you know any other Romanovs? Who do you know? Please leave your answer in the comment section, and I would like to make my video about that person.